Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome. My name is Marie Vickles. I'm the Director of Education here at the Pérez Art Museum Miami. It's lovely to have you all joining us on this rainy afternoon. It's probably one of the best places to be today. I want to give a special welcome and thank you to everyone that joined us today from Teresita's alma mater, FIU. Thank you. PAM is dedicated to inviting and nurturing relationships with all South Florida universities, and we so value this opportunity to connect more closely with FIU over the next few months as we have this exhibition up, and we look at the work of an artist that is from Miami, raised here, and now we are so proud to have her work here in the museum during the next few months. Some other activities happening today after this talk. You can stick around and join us. We have a Spanish public tour presented by Goya today and actually every Saturday. It will meet in the lobby at 2 p.m. We also have second Saturday art making happening in the museum and perhaps not outside today because of the weather. Following today's conversation, we will take questions from the audience, and as we are recording, we ask that you raise your hand and wait for the mic to come to you. It helps us to pick up all the audio so that when the talk is then later broadcast on our YouTube and video channels, that people are able to hear what questions were asked. Now, if you're able to silence your cell phones, I will do mine right now. I would like to go ahead and introduce Dr. Ana Dopico and Teresita Fernández. I will give a little bit of background and history on their work and then welcome them to the stage. So, Dr. Ana Dopico was born in Havana, grew up in Miami, and teaches at New York University. She is the director of the King Juan Carlos of Spain Center and associate professor of comparative literature in Spanish and Portuguese. She teaches comparative studies of Cuba, the Americas, and the Global South. She has published work on Cuban and Cuban American imaginaries, comparativism, and intellectual history, Latin American visual art, race, political memory, and Cuban cultural history. She is presently completing a book titled Cubanologies, A Cultural History for Cambridge University Press. Professor Dopico is also the author of the blog and book project Cuba Cargo/Cult, whose essays reflect the period from December 17, 2014 through the death of Fidel Castro. She is presently researching a new book project about Miami, Cold Civil Wars, Race Politics in Black and Cuban Miami, 1960 through 1980. Teresita Fernández is a 2005 MacArthur Foundation Fellow and the recipient of a number of awards, including a 2003 Guggenheim Fellowship and a Louis Comfort Tiffany Biennial Award in 1999. Appointed by President Barack Obama, she was the first Latina to serve on the United States Commission of Fine Arts, a 100-year-old federal panel that advises the President and Congress on national matters of design and aesthetics. Her new public art project, Paradise Parados, will be installed on the rooftop of the Brooklyn Academy of Music's Harvey Theater in 2020. Fernandez's recent site-specific commissions include Vignales, Mayumbo, Mississippi, the New Orleans Museum of Art Sculpture Garden, 2019, Island Universe, Ford Foundation, New York, 2019, Autumn, Nothing Personal, Harvard University, Cambridge, Massachusetts, 2018, Stacked Waters, Blayton Museum of Art, University of Texas, Austin, 2009, Blind Blue Landscape, Venice Art Site, Naoshima, Japan, 2009, and Seattle Cloud Cover, Olympic Sculpture Park, Seattle, in 2006. So please join me in welcoming Teresita and Ana.
Welcome, everyone. This is a momentous occasion for many reasons, particularly because we have a retrospective of a major artist who has shaped the landscape not only of contemporary art, but of what art means and how it intervenes into a public discourse. And because she's a daughter of Miami and all that that involves. It's a momentous day to welcome her and it's a deep honor for me to be here as her interlocutor and her friend. And I wanted to just ask Teresita what the moment feels like, what this momentous moment feels like personally, and the emotional and the intellectual and the affective world that it brings to you.
Thank you so much, Anna. I want to just say that this woman is brilliant and incredible, and we only found each other recently, which is part of the problem, right? Is that we don't even know one another. And Anna is maybe the only person that I could have this conversation with, because Anna also grew up in Miami, and we've both been in New York for decades, and kind of had to leave to have professional careers and to be validated by the outside world and to deal with all of our layers of inherited stuff, that has to do with being first generation Americans and the children of immigrants, and the sort of result of Miami during a very tumultuous time. And so the first thing that I would say is that you are the mirror image of that in many ways, which is why I wanted to have this conversation with you. And I'm an artist, and you're a scholar, but we've experienced many of the same things in that sort of displacement and in that sort of like diaspora of the diaspora of the diaspora in all its different permutations. So for me, part of the importance and the momentous aspect of this conversation has to do with the fact that my almost 16-year-old daughter is in the audience, and that and I know that you have daughters too, and we're raising our children in New York, and there's something that I don't want her to have to um, struggle with, which is an understanding of who she is and where she comes from. And in many ways, I feel like that we had to leave Miami in order to understand that and to decipher that for ourselves. So that's why I'm here. That's my sort of personal investment in it. And this idea that this is not an anomaly, that like I'm just here talking with you, but that this city is full of people who had the same exact sort of ingredients, if you will, that we have, and how it is that we can kind of connect that past of growing up here with our present and with future generations, like my daughter and that of the FIU students that are in the audience. So this conversation is for you, so that you don't have to work as hard to figure out who you are and where you come from.
I want to start, because our time is limited, directly with the work. And I'm going to riff on the elemental in different ways. First, with the elemental as material, the material that you work in, where it comes from, how it's shaped, how you think about its materiality in your aesthetic and in the labor that it involves. Could you speak to that a little bit?
Yeah, so I think of materials as being really loaded and as having their own narratives and histories. And I think of this as a kind of material intelligence, which is, I'm almost kind of like a messenger or someone who's kind of shaping something that already has its own history. And if you think about it, everything, like what it is to be an artist or a sculptor, especially, is the sense of kind of shaping something from like the material of the world, of the earth. Like every single thing around us, everything in this room, everything that we can touch, what we're wearing, is made from something that comes from the landscape. And so this idea that every tactile thing already has a lot of information in it is the first thing. And sometimes what something has is almost like, it almost has like a very haunted quality to it, or layers of narratives that are not visible but that are loaded with sort of uh, psychological conflict and the history of human beings and violence and yeah, kind of cultural things that attach to it that make it much more than just a material, the way that you might be taught to think about a material in art school, which is like, oh, well, you can you can work with ceramics, or you can work with, you know, oil paints, or you can work with synthetics. But this idea that the material comes from to you already loaded with the world in it already.
So you work distinctively. There are elements that are very palpable, even if we want, and we're aching almost to touch them, right? Malachite, gold, charcoal, and I wonder if you can, having seen some of the work that incorporates that, if you can talk about what each of those particular elements means and how it's launched you into a project.
Yeah, so it's not a linear thing. It's kind of like a blind searching. And I said this in the gallery earlier, that when I make something and it's all done and I explain the idea, it seems like it's this very sort of pat sort of story that has a beginning and an end. When I'm actually making something, that process is a blind process. It is a process of and really the thing that I can emphasize the most is the idea of attention. I'm really interested in attention as a strategy for understanding things that I don't understand. And so it's this idea that you know something and you know what you want to say because it lives in you and you're experiencing it, but you don't yet know the form of it. And so I work around something and I start to sort of just collect. And I remember when I was a little kid, I would make lists. I would make these lists, and the lists had on them things that were not related. And I kind of fine-tuned, I think, as an adult, which is why you have to pay attention to the things that you do, right? Because sometimes you're doing them, and that's what being an artist is, but they're not called being an artist. And so list making was one of those things. And a lot of the pieces in the show are really about ideas that normally don't get put together, because the world is, and our perception is highly controlled by, you know, dominant powers and by the canon, right? And so what you learn in school has nothing to do, what you learn even in elementary school about your own history, if anything, may have nothing to do with who you are, where what you're about. And so so yeah, that's sort of that. If I had to cite one of the pieces in the show where I could illustrate that, it would be Vignales. So it's the sort of subterranean cavernous looking room that has the sculpture and the green images, and that piece is a reference to the Vignales Valley in Cuba. Which is a place, you know, that I had pictures of my mother and my grandmother standing in, and which is a sort of iconic place in the Cuban imaginary, but which I had never seen. And like many places in Cuba and in Havana, as a young child, I had a kind of map in my head of streets, places, cities, that was fully formed. I knew where you could go get fabric because I was listening to my aunts and my grandmother and my mother, who came as a teenager, talk about these things. And so I had this imaginary map in my mind, which is not unlike if you look at like Smithson's Lemuria, which was like this invented country that he came up with, right? That existed in my mind simultaneously with, you know, what was really around me or what I was reading in books about quote unquote American history. And that sort of imagined thing was a really powerful influence. So if you look at the Vignales piece, which is about that place, which I eventually ended up going to and walking and photographing the landscape and the caves, the rocks that it's made of, one of the rocks, which is a rock that I found and should be kind of like a museum specimen, but I just saw this thing and I acquired it. And it's a piece of malachite that comes from the Democratic Republic of Congo. And I sat with that rock for a long time. I didn't know what I would do with it. The idea came later. But when I looked at it, it reminded me exactly of the Vignales Valley and all of these images that I had seen. And I just loved it. Like I liked living with it. I liked having it close to me because it had information that I hadn't yet figured out. And so the piece ended up being all of these malachite rocks. When I was in the caves themselves, and I talk about this idea of stacked landscape, this idea that you're always in more than one place at once. You know, I was in these caves that had markings made by indigenous Taino people before colonization in Cuba. The same caves were enslaved people who had escaped from surrounding plantations, cimarrones, who had would use the caves for refuge, to basically hide and to survive. And so the Valley of Vignales started to take on all of these layers as I was looking at this rock, which came from Africa, and trying to create this image, which was this imagined image in my mind, created by stories that I was surrounded with, and a black and white picture. And then there's the third element, which is that there's the thing I created, which is none of those things and all of those things, which is why it's a stacked landscape. It's this idea that all of these things live inside of you simultaneously. Yeah, and it was also a real attempt to, and a real need perhaps, to understand my relationship to Cuba as something that was not about the revolution only, right? But that was about geology, that was about this sort of ancientness, that was about the idea of the Caribbean as being a global place, a very sophisticated place intellectually. I only read, Caribbean literature as an adult. I had to kind of go and look for it to understand it. And the more I read and understood, Derek Walcott or Glissant or Martí or Lezama Lima, the more I understood who I was. Because even living in Miami in an immigrant community of Cuban exiles, I did not learn that anywhere, right? It was like a kind of displacement upon a displacement. So that particular piece is very important to me in terms of how the materiality connected to the African diaspora, the Cuban diaspora, layers of immigration and exile, and also the lushness of these images, which lived in my mind, almost like these kind of Jungian, like collective imagination. Like they were universal images for me.
So I had the chance to write about Vignales, and I encountered it at Teresita's gallery in New York, and she presented it during that opening, right? That small opening that we had, and I think reflecting on it might give us a stepping stone, because when I saw Vignales, Teresita's work, and in moving through, and if you see the work again, it refuses all of the overdetermined image repertoires that you have for Cuba, right? There is no cartography. There are no satellite images, right, of missile silos. There are no, there is no decadence porn from Havana. It makes you encounter the elemental, and if you're Cuban American, of a world that you claim and and is absolutely elemental in saturation, in light. And it also demands something of you, because it incites you, because you want to identify with it. You want to know, you want to see the outline of a cave, or you want to see the valley. And then you realize that you're being seduced and challenged by a work which is also not Vignales, because the images, these stunning, and really I was transported, and I still get goosebumps when I think of that work. And I took my daughter Elena, and she saw it, and we were both transported. And you're before it, and you're trying to make sense of it in your own intellectual, aesthetic, and affective world, but it's a very intimate process. And what's so moving is that you discover you're not looking at Vignales, you're looking at an image, right, of the malachite, right, a scan of the malachite, which comes from Congo.
Yeah,
so I wondered if you
to
can
clarify. So like the rocks that are on the actual rocks on the sculptural bases are the actual rocks from Congo. The ceramic pieces on the wall are basically, I did a CAT scan of the rock from Africa, and I basically went inside of it so that I turned really tiny and could walk around in there. And the interesting thing to me, the revelatory thing for me, was that the inside of the rock you could be tiny, tiny, this big inside the rock. What you could see when you looked around looked exactly like the Vignales Valley. And so the panels that you see on the wall are actually those tiny images, which is what you would see if you were like this microscopic person inside that rock. And so there are all these scales functioning at once. And this is important too, because it's almost like as a viewer, you become the size of the thing that you're looking at, which is what intimacy is. It's sort of like when you look at a dollhouse or a diorama where you know that where the limits of your physical body are, but there's a kind of projection, and it's a visual, imaginary, dreamlike projection into this other image. And so, yeah, it is not an illustration of Congo or Africa or Vignales. It is actually a stacked landscape that is visual and historical and intellectual and emotional. Like that's actually what's being stacked. It's not just like verbatim, like stacking Africa, Cuba, Miami, right? It's all of those things. It's a sort of subjective thing as well, including an emotional landscape and a psychological landscape.
And I think what it summons for you as a viewer, as a subject, because it makes you a subject, right? Your work makes you reimagine yourself as a subject before the work of art. It also makes you understand how conceptual and abstract art, how public art is not the two-dimensional textbook, right? Historical and canonical definition, that we've come down, that it's a Jackson Pollock hanging, in a museum in New York City. You've spoken about Jack Whitten, right, working during the civil rights movement, about Ana Mendieta, about Felix González Torres. And I wonder if you can talk a little bit about the methods, right? How conceptual, abstract art, how experiential work, how work based on research, because you're a thinking, right? Thinking artist, creates what you make.
I mean, it's interesting because the artists that you mentioned, all of them who are very important to me, are all artists who have always made deeply political work, but whose work is not seen as political. And this is the case. I kind of see myself as coming from a whole lineage of artists that very much use abstraction and conceptual sort of strategies to talk about social political things without giving up on the richness of the imagination and poetry and history and intimacy. And so Jack Whitten, who I quote in the catalog interview, is somebody who in the 1960s, when everybody was making during the civil rights movement, most African American artists were making figurative work that depicted, the struggles of Black life in America, and Jack Whitten was making abstract art, sometimes really abstract art. And he died just a couple of years ago. And in one of his last videos, somebody asked him, why weren't you making figurative work? Like there was such a need for that, for people to see themselves. And he said, I know it's political because I put it in there. And so that line was always really important to me because it changed how I thought about my own work, but how I thought about everything that I looked at, which is that there's sometimes a kind of, this is the case of Ana Mendieta's work, which has been, like Felix's as well, very much fetishized after their work to mean all kinds of things. Felix was a very political person. Felix is somebody who has, as the years pass since his death, he has been more and more whitewashed. But these are all artists who were being very deliberate about making artwork that was incredibly universal and political and psychological, but also really private and really intimate. And really intellectual. And I think that that's how I naturally function in my own studio practice, is that I've never felt a need to actually like explain everything to the viewer. I think that there's certain things that have to be explained. Certainly after 2016, if you look at certain works that I made, like the USA map piece, there was no space at that particular moment for abstraction to dominate. I was being very deliberate and I was calling it what it was. There are other pieces where I felt less of a need to do that. Vignales is one of them, where the actual power of the piece lay in not calling it and not spelling it out, not making it a caricature of itself. So yeah.
So we've talked about the elemental as material, maybe as method. And Teresita's work insists on developing a discourse, which you help shape because you see it as part of your responsibility, of developing a language that sets it apart from what a museum might tag, right, a work as. And you develop your own vocabulary beyond stacked landscape, wayfinding, placemaking, right? So that you begin to give the reader, see, I'm a literary scholar, you begin to get the interlocutor, the viewer, right, to be an active subject before art, which is, I think, something very necessary, in that if art students know this, but the general public feels very passive, right, before a work of art. And your work is designed to abolish that passivity, to have the viewer recognize themselves in reflection in the movement. So I want to talk about the elemental now as place, right, and some of your public art, right, which some of it is quite vast. The Madison Square Park Fata Morgana was huge, and it completely transformed that space. And that space was populated by events that were connected to the work. So I wonder if you can talk about, the elemental in terms of the placemaking, right, that you make with that public art. Something that's anti-monumental, something that summons a community or a recognition of human subjects and by human subjects.
I mean, a lot of the pieces have to do with this, especially the big public artworks. It's kind of like this, and I don't think I've ever even said this before, but it's kind of like this very contradictory exercise of wanting to make something that will not disappear. And that's actually I've always worked large scale. It's like this desire to not disappear, to like be present, And at the same time, the contradictory part is that I want to make something that's so ephemeral that it actually disappears. And so with Fata Morgana, the reference was actually a mirage, right? A Fata Morgana is a kind of mirage. It's like an optical illusion that forms as this superior mirage over the horizon. And I thought to myself, well, that would be the ultimate, right? Like abstracting the entire landscape. And like there's something very sort of grandiose about that, right? But if anything, a mirage actually does that, right? Which is this thing that's, bigger than monumental, right? Because nature is bigger than monumental, but it's there and it's not there. And so that's part of what I'm trying to do, which is really, really hard to do. Don't try this at home kind of thing, because it's like a little, it's hard to do that. But it's also a kind of metaphor for this idea of erasure and this idea of who gets to count as being present, who is present. So with Fata Morgana, one of the things I always say, that there's like the physical structure, right? The sculpture we can take a picture of, that's the physical structure. And then there's like the social structure. And the social structure is the harder part. It's really hard to work with these agencies. It's really hard to work with parks, with public entities, with governments. The social structure is one that requires a lot of effort and a lot of determination, because oftentimes people want to take the object and then turn it into something that it's not, or use it in a way that it's not meant to be used. And so again, I'm really interested in the bigger the piece are, bigger the pieces are, the more interested I am in that individual viewer and in the intimacy of that idea that each person is almost like an individual public. With Fata Morgana, I was very deliberate about all the programming and language that was created around that show. So we did a bunch of collaborations, even questioning and pushing the Madison Square Park Conservancy to think about, well, who do you mean when you mean the public? Madison Square Park is right in the middle of the Flatiron district, surrounded by very expensive condos. If you go at any time of the day, there's all kinds of people there, but somehow the public was implied to mean people who live in those condos. And if you went at noon, who you would see there were all of the Central American and all the Mexican workers that were in the back of the restaurants around there, who would use this park, or the nannies. And so that didn't kind of count as the public. And so I kept really wondering, well, who else constitutes the public? The public is this very mutable thing. We think that just because we put something outside that it's automatically democratic, but it's sort of like the internet. It's not democratic, right? It's completely controlled. Even what gets to be put into that public space goes through like a whole process that's very particular and that isn't necessarily democratic. And so all of the programming that happened, like the bilingual poetry events, which the collaborations with dance, and Yesenia's piece. I worked with Afro-Cuban scholar Yesenia Celier, who basically recreated under Fata Morgana Dia de Reyes, which Dia de Reyes was the only day in colonial times in Cuba where enslaved Africans could perform their music and their dances in public space. And this was recreated. This was right after Obama opened relations with Cuba. And so the moment was very important as well. And there was like a whole conga line under this thing. There was, the lyrics were written specifically for it. And everything that happened, like I had never seen that big of a Cuban community, especially Afro-Cuban community from the tri-state area in one place, because it was, 1,000 people maybe. And the entire thing happened under the piece, which means that it was doubled. It was doubly present. So it was playing with his idea of erasure and reinserting like presence, like not disappearing. And the other thing about that is playing with that idea of invisibility on this grand scale is that what was actually happening is that, like, if you were just somebody walking by from Italy, like to have some ice cream at the park, and you saw this thing, it might look to you like a drumming circle or like a festival or people in costumes. But for the people, for those of us who were there, for the Cuban community that was there, and it was a very sort of intergenerational and also like all kinds of people, right, that normally don't come together. It was very much a religious ceremony. It was very much a religious ceremony. And that aspect of it was completely invisible to anybody who didn't know what they were looking at, right? So that's important, right? Is this idea of co-opting the invisible to kind of insert something that's invisible to other people. And those are some of the things that I'm trying to do. And when I'm doing that, I'm not always telling you I'm doing that. Like I can talk about it now because it happened already. But I'm always doing that. So I'm just not divulging it, or I'm divulging it at different points.
So that public art, beyond your play with light and reflection, is about making the visible invisible and the invisible visible. Because those events, which I was at the Dia de Reyes, if you know New York, you don't have people of color at the inauguration of a major public artwork, really, in New York. It's an exception. Maybe it's something that's growing, and much less Afro-Latinos, right? Afro-Cubans, unheard of, right?
It wasn't an art audience, is I think also what you're trying to say, is that it was the programming of the piece. You didn't have to know about art or even know about public art to understand what was happening. In fact, part of the gesture as an artist and in a collaborative mode was to actually just give up the space and offer it to somebody else that I was interested in how she would program it. So this was what Yesenia would want to do there. So Yesenia is somebody who probably wouldn't get invited to do something at the park, but I would, you know, and it's like, a lot of times what I do with the public programming, I did this at Harvard too, is sort of, it's a sidestepping. It's like, okay, here's a platform. This is created. There is a social structure under this. I'm a sculptor. I'm making this thing. Yes, I'm working on this other thing behind the scenes that you may not even see. And I'm bringing in partners. I'm bringing in the people that I want to collaborate with. And I am handing the space over to them and saying, you do what you think needs to happen here. And that's an important aspect of collaboration, because for me, real collaborations are about equity. They are actually about both parties getting equal amounts out of the collaboration. And in order to do that, it wasn't like somebody coming to perform in my piece, but rather, here's a forum and here are some resources, because everybody got paid too, and that's important. That's part of the social structure, which isn't as like glamorous as like the physical structure, but it's a really important part, because all of the people who performed that day, all of the musicians and the person who organized it got paid, you know. And so it's this way of sort of taking the resources and creating this other structure, and then moving aside. So that's an important part of my practice as well.
But it's radically different. It's radically different, and it's new, right? And as someone who knows art, this doesn't happen around Richard Serra installations, right, when they're in public, right? So I think this is something that you make a contingency of your work, and you therefore create a public sphere around your art that wasn't present before. And so you shift the horizon, right? An artist, by doing that, shifts the horizon of expectations of who will be summoned, who will be there, who will be subjects, and the expectation then of why isn't this public at the next event, right? So it's deeply powerful for someone who's outside the art world and occasionally writes about it, who transits New York City or Miami, to see how the space reconvenes, right? A community, right? Speaking of community, I want to talk about the elemental as Miami, right? A city of politics, a city of memory, a city of light, which so deeply shapes your work, right? Both our parents we grew up in Miami, slightly a few years apart, but during a Miami where our parents, who are Cuban American, came into Jim Crow Miami, a Black community struggling for civil rights, and those Cold War Cuban exiles most of them made a fatal, decisive choice to identify with whiteness, right? To identify with white supremacy, right? To save themselves by not identifying as being mixed, as being Afro-descendant, right? Or if they were phenotypically Black, many of those people left Miami and went to New Jersey or to New York. So we grew up with that myth that in Cuba there was no racism, that we were living a striated, divided world, that white people were racist toward Black people and toward us, but that we were different from Black people and that we had to respect, right, the separateness. We are a generation that is very crossed by a lot of
Shame.
A lot of shame, but a lot of boundaries of exemplarity and what we could not be. All under, right, the beautiful myth, right, of Cuban success and exemplarity. And so I wonder if since your work takes up race, and since you and I are both at a point where we had to defer many of those conversations about what shaped us, I wonder if we could talk about Miami, about your growing up here, about your relationship to it, and to how we think about this city and our debt really now, right, to critical race theory, to African American precursors in the academy, in institutions, and our understanding of ourselves as Latinx or Latinos, and how we are, and you particularly, are negotiating that.
Yeah, so I mean, it's interesting because you at the end where you were talking about Fata Morgana, and I thought, yeah, but the sidestepping comes because I got to a certain point in my career and realized that I didn't have a community. I was like, sort of like, because this is what we were taught as the kids of immigrants, is that go to school, make it, you get your degree, and you're kind of like this solo kind of hamster on a wheel that's just supposed to achieve all of these things at the expense of community, right? At the expense of actually struggling through understanding the humanness and the inconveniences of all of the baggage that our parents brought with them, and how that manifested when it was confronted with a Jim Crow South that looked like nothing that they had seen in Cuba, even though there was tons of racism in Cuba. And so I can speak to that from my personal experience, which is that there's something, there was, it was, the feeling was that we were not treated well, and I felt that all the time. I felt brown. I felt dirty. I felt like people really, like there was a kind of muttness to what we were that people would put down. And there was no pride around what we were. And even our own families were in such a kind of survival mode that they were really being rewarded for being lighter complexion, but they were also being pitted against African Americans, and specifically African Americans, because what I recall in Miami growing up was that I was called a spick. I was told to go back to wherever I came from. I saw my mother and my grandfather, who are both much darker than I am, be treated badly by school principals, by you name it, right? But I knew that we weren't treated as badly as African Americans were treated, and they knew this, and so there was a kind of there's this sort of brokenness that happens when you're surviving and you don't speak the language and you're being rewarded for something, but you're also being treated really poorly, and there's a kind of it's messed up, right? But this is the way that white supremacy works: is it gets people to do the work of pitting themselves against one another. When, for me, part of the realization was when I left Miami, and so like between us, we always say, like, have they ever left Miami? Because there's a kind of before and after. Like, if you've never left Miami, you live in a bubble here. I know many people who live in Miami who don't, who think that they're white, and they're not. They are phenotypically not white anywhere else except in Miami. Certainly not in New York or anywhere else. So what happened is when I moved to Richmond, Virginia, which was, the capital of the Confederacy, I graduated from FIU and I went to graduate school in Richmond, Virginia at VCU. And within the week of me being there, with all the so-called privilege that we thought we had in Miami as Cubans, and also being treated badly, but we didn't talk about that, right? Because there was this kind of sense that, we were, above it somehow, right? And that's part of actually how the shame that our parents experienced by being treated badly was manifested. It's not a judgment. It's actually a trying to understand the pain and the trauma of the displacement, fused with like the incredible anti-Black sentiment that they arrived to in this city, right? Which still exists in this city. This is one of the poorest cities in the country. And so all of that kind of, you stick it into a pot and you churn it all together, and it turns out lots of different permutations of toxicity and of like shame and of like confusion, especially for a child, about what it is that you are, right? Like you get treated one way, this way. And then, there was also like the English only ballots. 1980 was a really important year in this city. I remember I was in 6th grade. English only ballots, go back to where you came from. speak English, like people looking down and saying, speak English, you know, like we were just wrong. We were not black enough. We were not white enough. We were not anything. We were just like these in-between people. It was also when the McDuffie, when the riots happened after 4 white police officers were set free after the death of Arthur McDuffie, who was a salesman who was killed. Murdered, yes, by these 4 white policemen who were set free. And, you know, I remember a city that was rioting. In that same year, 1980, when I was in 6th grade, you know, 125,000 Cuban refugees arrived. And then that was a whole other layer of confusion and shame about who you were, because they weren't Cuban. They were like different Cubans, right? So there were all these hierarchies that different ethnic and racial groups in this city, and you can add to that Bahamians and Haitians who were not treated like African Americans, right? So it wasn't just this black Cuban thing. It was lots of different groups in the city, all who were trying to survive in a city that was basically founded on white supremacy, right? Like, so it's there was something very liberating for me about understanding my own history. Like, this is not taught in Miami even, right? This is like, when you leave and you like, well, when I got to Richmond to finish that part of the story, which, because it's an important part of the story, within a week of being there, my studio was in downtown Richmond. And within a week of being there, I was walking around in different neighborhoods trying to find my way around town, buying stuff, settling in. And I was walking through a white neighborhood and I was told to get out. You know, you better get out. And then a few days later, I was in a black neighborhood and I was told, you better get out. And I was like, whoa, you know, like, this never happened in Miami. And there was this really kind of trying to understand that in a country, and this is what was different for our families arriving, right? But in a country, the United States, where race has always been seen as this binary thing, as black or white. And there's this kind of like sense that that anybody else had to assimilate to one side or to the other, but also that they weren't allowed to ever be white or to ever be black. And so there was this sort of nothingness. There was this idea that you are nothing. And I think that that's the most dangerous thing of all, is the feeling that you're nothing, that you somehow aren't enough of anything to count. And so when I started to talk about these things, what I found is that a lot of other people felt this way too, and that there wasn't a way of actually talking about it, because there's great shame associated to a lot of it. If you throw into that, you know, the kind of classism that exists, especially in Miami and growing up, and different groups of people, there was a whole lot of confusion, because when I left Miami, the world, like Richmond, but also even New York, was very much a black and white place along those binary lines. And I grew up in a city where blackness could mean a lot of different things. It could mean you were Haitian, it could mean you were Bahamian, it could mean you were Cuban. Does anybody remember that Que Pasa USA episode where Joe has a black friend, or not a friend, but Joe has a fight at school, in high school? Joe has a, and I'm saying this because I can only say this here in Miami, because if I said this in New York at a lecture, nobody would know what the hell we're talking about. So if you remember that episode of Que Pasa USA, which was the first bilingual show on PBS, by the way, and this is why storytelling is important, because we saw ourselves in Que Pasa USA. It was one of the few places we could see the specificity of the kinds of things that we were experiencing. Joe has a fight at school, at high school, with a black kid, African American kid, right? Because black in this case would mean always African American, not Haitian, Bahamian, or anything else. And he comes home and he's talking about it. He did this and he did that, and sort of like they were rivals, right? They didn't get one another. They were fighting. They had gotten to a fight. They were in each other's faces. And the kid is the guy is then dating Carmencita, or likes Carmencita. He's going to come and study with Carmencita. And so this whole triangulated in this like kind of funny sitcom sort of structure. And then, so it's like this whole conversation about like Cuban and black, and you're this and you're that, and you do that, you do that. And then all of a sudden, a family friend comes in, Marta's cousin, and it's, I forgot the name, right? Like I'm pulling out of like my stacked landscapes here, but and it's a black Cuban guy, and he's like, "Hey, ¿cómo está? Oye, and his friend says, "Hey, he's black," and Joe says, "He's not black, he's Cuban." You know, and so like that was the punchline, is the like the complexity of A, the anti-blackness, B, the fact that the ethnic part of not just being one kind of black, but that you could be lots of different kinds of black, and that if you were Cuban, you were more Cuban than black. Like it was just like, these are all complicated conversations, you know, like we could write like a PhD on this. And yet, even in our own families, when we'd come home like Thanksgiving and Christmas, nobody was talking about it. Like we would literally be dealing with those things like at, I know in my family, like at the Thanksgiving table. So, you know, and calling out our own parents on things that we just didn't agree with. And so, yeah, I think that a lot of that, and actually having the courage to talk about those things in a way that's cathartic and that calls out some of the things that we were brought up with as really problematic as well, and deeply racist, and understanding to the mode of survival that all of these Cuban immigrants, as well as African Americans in the city, and Haitians, and Bahamians, and Puerto Ricans, and Dominicans were experiencing at a time where everybody was just getting by, kind of, in that kind of, especially in that pivotal moment of 1980, where there was so much anti-everything. Yeah.
When I saw American Fires, like the firework and the charcoal America, I thought of the McDuffie riots. I'm a little older than Teresita, and I was at a junior prom on Key Biscayne, and they sent us home, right, because they were worried that we would die on the highway because we would have to drive out to Westchester. I went to Coral Park Senior High School, and I lived right near FIU. We would have to drive, and we saw fires as it was going. So Miami seemed very much a volatile city, right? A city in flames, and I see that in your work, that political memory, that apprehension, right?
Yeah, I think it's not like it's not I'm not illustrating that. You know, I'm also thinking
No.
about border
No.
politics. I'm thinking about what's
Yeah.
happening right now. I'm thinking about the extreme anti Latinx, anti-immigrant, anti-black sentiment in this country, which has always been the norm. This is not new. And so this is happening in real time. I don't have to go back to 1980 because all I have to do is, you know, look at everything that's happening every day. And so this is, it's not, I'm talking here about Miami things and biographical things because I know that this audience can relate to it, and because my daughter's in the audience. But the work is not about illustrating that. The work is about how that is a version, a micro version, or maybe biographical version of everything that's happening in the rest of the world and in the country anyway, to a lot of different people, to Muslims, to, you know, like you can keep going. So it's a universal sort of sentiment as well. It's not an illustration of my particular experience.
No, I think that's clear. I think that allows us to move a little bit into your recent work and the political moment, right? And your work in the political moment, and your work as an artist, as a public intellectual, right? As someone who's intervened in a presidential council on the arts, who speaks to the Ford Foundation about the complete absence of Latinos and Latinas in curatorial positions. I wonder if you can speak to that recent engagement, or maybe not so recent, but relatively recent engagement, where you have had conversations, open conversations that have already changed the landscape of arts institutions. In New York, I can count 3 or 4 people who have jobs as a result of an event at the Ford Foundation that Teresita convened. So I wonder if you can speak to that, to the complications around that, how you came to that, and how you balance that with your work, which is a difficult balancing act.
Yeah, so what started to happen, I didn't set out to do all these things. Again, like when you see somebody acting as a leader or stepping up, it's usually out of a sense of desperation and out of an understanding that there's something wrong and you keep waiting for somebody to fix it and there's nobody to fix it or say anything about it. And you kind of look around and you're like, oh, I think I'm this person who's supposed to say it, right? And this is, I would say that to all, uh, to everybody in the audience, but especially to young people, that if something does not exist and that bothers you, you're supposed to figure it out and you're supposed to be the one who does something about it. And so I didn't do that because I wanted to do that or because I needed another job, but because it's hard enough to just be an artist, but because there was a kind of sense of responsibility and a kind of like desperation really to understanding that I actually had the most privilege to be able to even start a conversation about that. And so what I started to see happening was that the more successful I became, the less of a Latina I was seen as. And you know, I started to see, for example, my friend Felix Gonzalez Torres is who was a brown man who spoke with a thick accent, who was gay, who was an immigrant and came as an adult to this country. Miami is the first place in this country where Felix lived, and it's the place that he died. I saw him turning into this gay white man. You know, the art world just kind of like transformed him. I also noticed that one of the few parts of my Wikipedia entry that would get changed was my personal narrative. And I realized that there's a kind of, and again, this is the way that systemic oppression works, is that if you are good at something and you're successful, you are rewarded for moving towards whiteness. And that's what was happening to me, is that the more sort of like fancy I became and successful I became, the less of a Latina I became, the less I became Cuban American. And it started to bother me because I was who I was and I was making the work that I was making, not in spite of those things, but because of those things. That's actually what made me interesting, is like Miami was an incredible place to grow up, a really messed up place to grow up. But the idea that all of those historical things, which I document in the catalog, by the way, and that's actually a big part of not disappearing, is documenting. So the catalog for me is a document where I talk about the McDuffie riots and where I talk about the English only ballots and the Maria boat lift and how that affected me as a young child growing up and then becoming an adult, right? And becoming an artist. So that like who I am is all of those things mixed in there at once. So what I started to notice is that with Ana Mendieta was the same thing. Ana Mendieta did not have a museum show in her lifetime. After her death, there's this sort of fetishizing of somebody. There's a whole kind of context. So she wasn't telling her own narrative. Okay, Felix's narrative has been changed slightly. Like it gets sort of, it happens very slowly. So these are changes that happen slowly. And I started to feel in real time, just because I hadn't died and I was present to have agency over my own context, that it was slowly happening to me too. And I didn't like it. I didn't like it because I realized that I actually had the power, and power is a really important word. I had the power to point to the thing that always gets made invisible. And I also noticed like there's like these kinds of subtle things that get used. For example, Mark Rothko. Mark Rothko came as a 15-year-old immigrant to this country from Russia. Nobody thinks of him as a Russian American artist. Everybody thinks of him as an American artist. But Ana Mendieta was somehow Cuban or Cuban American. And so it was better to be Cuban or Cuban American or Chilean or Mexican or whatever. It was better to be anything Latin American than it was to be a US based Latina artist. I use Latinx because I think that the X is radical and that the X means the future, and the X rejects, you know, any kind of Latinidad that has to do with Europe or Spain or anything like that. But, you know, someone like Carmen Herrera, who is about to be 105, she has lived long enough. She's sort of outlived everybody who excluded her, but she she's not able to participate in her own narrative. So she still gets up every morning and paints, and she's still there, but she's fragile and she's not out doing these public things and speaking about her work and setting the record straight. And so it became really important to me to not have that happen to me. And part of that was telling my story and saying, no, actually, I'm like this Cuban kid from Miami. Like, that's what I am. And the yeah, so so I again, yeah, so it's and so I'm also not Cuban enough. That was a whole other thing. Then there was like a whole lot of interest in Cuban art, but I wasn't Cuban enough. So there'd be like a show of Cuban art, but I wouldn't be in it because I was Cuban American. But then there would be a show of American art, or like I've never been in the Whitney Biennial, for example. So I wasn't American enough. I wasn't Cuban enough. I wasn't Latin American enough. I wasn't white enough. I wasn't black enough. And so I was like, okay, so I'm not the only person experiencing this, and I'm actually doing okay. I have a great gallery. I'm having museum shows. I can publish this book and say whatever I want. I'm not dead. I'm not 105. And so it became really important to me to do that, and that is why people see me as the person speaking about that. But it was not a comfortable thing to do. It was a very vulnerable thing to do. And that's actually what it looks like when you hold on to your own power. It's sort of seen as very sort of glamorous after the fact when you're getting attention for it, but when you're doing it in real time, and I have been doing this for 20 years, it's not so fun when you're doing it. It's not so fun when you're the person in the crowd of people who like stands up and actually says something or corrects somebody, or says, hey, it's like none of your diversity panels include a Latino, or none of your, so it's about that. And it was a very organic kind of choice for me, because it is also the only way that I could be true to myself. And I actually think that being true to yourself is the most radical thing that you could do. So when we all talk about equity and social justice, if you don't know who you are, it is impossible for you to participate in that, and that is what my work is about. My work is about finding yourself and like figuring out who you are by actually taking apart where you are. So it's like, where are we? Like, what is Miami? Miami is an indigenous word. Miami means big water or sweet water. And it's a reference to the tribes that lived around Lake Okeechobee. Okay. Ponce de Leon was the first European to go through and realize that Biscayne Bay was there. That's why it's named Biscayne Bay. It's a reference to Biscayne Bay in Spain. And so we have to figure out where we are, and what are who we are in relation to that, right? We have to peel back all those layers, because if we don't know who we are, then we cannot relate to one another, and we can't figure out who we are in relation to one another. And so at the crux of what I'm doing in the studio, and this is why I talk about privacy in the studio and the intimacy of the creative practice, is that in order for me to put that out there in an artwork and prompt that in the viewer, I actually have to look in the mirror and do that for myself and ask myself, okay, where are you? Where are you? Who are you?
I think this is a good moment for to open it to the audience. Yep. Questions?
Anyone have a question? We'll bring the mic to you. Let's see.
Hi, my name is Molly. So it's funny you had that conversation because I was just having like a debate with somebody the other day about my daughter's, like how I want her to identify herself, because I feel like identifying with a color, it doesn't make sense. Like even if somebody says they're white or they're black, it's like, how are you defined with a color? And then with her, I guess her technical term would be ethnically ambiguous because I'm Puerto Rican and Russian, and then her father is Jamaican. So my question for you is how do you tell the newest generation coming up that's like 4 and 5 different mixes, like how do they define, like, because I don't believe in saying a color. It's like I'm Puerto Rican, Russian, Jamaican. Yeah.
I mean, I don't know how to answer that for you or how to tell you to parent. I know that for me, I have enough respect for my children to not think that I have a right to tell them how to identify. That's actually their choice. That's actually part of the process. No, no. So it's like we each have to figure that out for ourselves, and our children have to do it too. At least that's how what I would hope for my children is that I'm not telling them what they are, but that they are finding pride in um, uh, understanding the contradictions and the layers of who they are and where they come from, regardless of what they look, you know, like, right? Because my daughters don't look anything like my grandfather, for example, but that doesn't mean that his experiences and my experiences as his granddaughter and what, you know, the kind of generational uh, perceptions and like ideas that we inherit are still there. So I don't know how to answer that for you, but I do believe in storytelling and creating pride and transparency around you know, the all of the aspects of who we are. And some of them are always like the nice stories. Sometimes they're, you know, like some of the stories we mentioned, which is that there was some messed up stuff too. Any other question?
Thank you. Uh, in light of there being so many students in the room, could you speak about the potential conflict between a focus on creating work that lives independently as an object uh, and the story behind it that, you know, that has been so deeply and movingly presented here, you know, when how would you address?
I would, it's so easy for me to answer that question because I have this answer for a lot of questions that sound like this. And that is when I'm presented with an either or, I say there's something really problematic with having to choose between those two things. And so, and again, this is the same thing as race, it's the same thing as gender. This idea that you have two choices, right? You could pick male, female, you could pick black, white, you could pick, you know, object or story. Like, why? Like, I refuse to live in that kind of binary world, and I actually think that it's not important. I think that we have lots of choices. I think that you could tell stories and make objects, and that they can be beautiful, and that they could be political, and that they could be all those things. And all of the sort of systems and structures that keep trying to tell us that it could be this or it could be that, that's where I would stop and just question even that, because I think that students in this room are inheriting a really problematic future, and I don't know how they're going to solve it. And I have great faith in them. I I think that they're going to have to come up with solutions that we've never had to think of. And so I cannot be condescending to this younger generation and act as though I know if this is a better choice or not, because they're dealing with problems that we will never have to deal with as the older adults in this room. That's the first thing. But the one suggestion I would make is to be suspicious when you only have two choices about something. Anything from an art professor, from anybody, from a family member, anytime that you only have two choices, you need to stop and ask yourself, wait a minute, like, why? Why does it matter? Why do I have to make figurative art or political art? Like, why can't I make both of those things? Why can't I change my mind? Why can't I, you know? So I think that that would be my most honest answer to you, is that there are more than two choices, and that they're not mutually exclusive.
It's been a real pleasure having the opportunity to listen to you speak about your work and your process, but particularly your upbringing here in Miami. as a second generation Cuban American that has grown up in Sweetwater, Florida, and left to Vermont and is forcing his roommates to eat picadillo and pastelitos. It's really powerful and inspiring to see that you are taking ownership of that past. I was hoping you could speak about what it's like to return to Miami and see if this landscape has changed or is changing for the better or for the worse. What's it been like for you coming back home?
So when I grew up in Miami, and again, I encourage you all to read the interview in the book because it's quite long and it's I talk about a lot of these things. But when I grew up in Miami, there were no museums here. As a high schooler, I remember going to the Low Art Museum, which was like the dustiest little like one room place with like one African mask and like what it was like whatever ended up there kind of. It looked almost like a basement. And I don't know what it looks like now, but I remember being in high school and just like driving there and just like having my little museum experience. I didn't go to Europe for the first time until I was almost 20 years old. And so things that I had learned in art history books, like, yeah, I didn't have some like special exposure to anything. Like I was really, and I always say like the suburban child, you know, lives in their imagination and travels through books. And so I had a very rich kind of like context, but there were no institutions. Yeah, there were no museums, right? There were no museums. So now when I see Miami, I think that there's, I mean, this museum certainly is like a total gift to this city, in great part. And you may not realize this being in it. So this is the thing about when you are too close to something or too far away from something, you don't see it. But when you, and this is why we had to leave, right? So you may not see these things because you're in it and you're too close to it. And people who are really far away, like say the New York art world, may not see it either. But there's something very special happening here right now, which is that this is the only, and I will say the only museum in this country that I could walk into where there is a director and a curator and a guard and a docent and an education person who are all people of color, who all speak Spanish, or most of them speak Spanish. It is quite extraordinary and quite unique. And even if you go to museums in New York, oftentimes the sort of diversity is all sort of like in the junior, lower level jobs, right? So like you get a lot of diversity with security guards, you get no curators and no museum directors that are Latino, that are Black. And so this is a very, very unique place in ways that you may be too close to even understand, but as someone who travels all over the place, and so that makes me very, very happy. And it makes me proud that my mid-career show is here. I also think that young artists in Miami, and this is the flip side of that, need to be very careful about being seduced by the art world when it descends here in December. And that a lot of what you see that have to do with the market and with like the kind of all the stuff that's not art, that's part of the ecosystem of art, and that, you know, we are in it whether you like it or not, like it's part of the whole machine. That's not where your attention should be, and that's not where you're going to find your good questions. I think that everybody in Miami who has any kind of power institutionally or organizationally in universities or anywhere else needs to really start validating people from Miami while they're in Miami so that they can stay in Miami and build careers here, rather than importing talent, importing architects, importing artists, importing, you know, talent, right? This is a rich city that's already naturally diverse, that is not, you know, there's a lot of poverty in the city, but there's a lot of wealth too to create institutional change. You have places like Ulite that are incredibly well funded. You have resources here as a young artist. The real question is, how can you stay here? How can you create a career here? How can you be successful and still make a life here. And those are things that I feel like weren't possible. I don't know how Anna feels, but that you kind of had to leave to get validated. It was almost like it would be impossible. Like that's the irony of it, is that it would be impossible for me to have this show in Miami if I had stayed here. And the person who made it happen, my show was co-curated by Franklin Sermons and Amala Cruz, both whom I've known for 20 years, but both whom I know from outside of Miami. So my show is here because Franklin, who's the director of this museum, who's somebody that I know from New York from 20 years ago, thought it was important for my show to be here, not because sort of Miami was validating me. And so I'm very, I would be very focused about young people putting pressure on the institutions around them. And you have more power than you know. But so that it isn't just a place where it's good to do like young arts or dash or ulai, but that you could imagine yourself being a 30-year-old artist here, a 40-year-old artist here, a 60-year-old artist here, with an international audience, art audience that descends in December and comes to see your work headlining something, rather than some European artist whose show we've seen traveling around the country and around the world 3 times, right? So I think that's the advice that I would give you, is that there's some amazing things happening here. Amazing, like there's this a very unique city in terms of what's capable of accomplishing. But I do think that pressure has to be put to validate and retain the talent.
I think we'll stop there. And I want to thank you for coming today and being part of this extraordinary conversation. Thank you so much.
Thank you.